Here was my first attempt. I left the Seestar turned on in my house, but I did not connect to it. Um, so I wanted to see if I could connect to it remotely. And so I took a drive and went to lunch, and we went to Chick-fil-A. And so I'm sitting in Chick-fil-A trying to connect, and it's saying that there's no Seestar found. It's not finding the Seestar at home, even though I left it turned on and it should. That's what I understood, is you'd be able to connect to it remotely. Well, I think what's going to have to happen is we're going to have to try this again to be sure, but I think you have to connect to the Seestar at home. So now we're back to the drawing board and we're driving home. So I'm just going to pull into my driveway. I know the Seestar is powered on. So I'm in my driveway and I'm going to connect to the Seestar from here. And then it comes up and it asks if I want to change to the remote Seestar because I'm close enough that it can sense it. And then it allows me to connect to the Seestar from my driveway. And so now I'm connected remotely, and you can see when I go back to the main screen up in the top left corner, that little green world icon. So I'm connected remotely, and now we're going to drive about a half mile away from our house just because there's somewhere we can park that's close by there. And half a mile away is probably enough that I can't detect my Seestar from a half mile away. So we're far enough away that we shouldn't be able to connect if we weren't already, but we are connected through this remote connection. So that was the secret, is we had to connect at home, connect to the remote Seestar, and then leave. And so that does add a few little thoughts in my mind that we'll go over at the end. And so right here we're in the process now of driving to that half mile away. But I'm staying connected as far as I can tell. Everything looks like I'm still connected. That icon is staying green. And so yeah, that's what I did wrong, but that adds some complication to this remote controlling your Seestar, because if you have to be in its proximity to connect to it, kind of what's the point? You're already there. I don't know. So we're connected. Now we're parked and I'm turning on the scenery mode. Now the Seestar is in my house a half hour away, and it's indoors because it is stormy outside today for us. And so I am just going into scenery mode because it's during the day, and I'm going to try and control the Seestar from half a mile away. So I'm just using the scenery mode and I am able to control it. And we're going to pan around here. It is indoors, so it's looking through the windows outside. You can see that it's pretty cloudy out there. Maybe we'll go and check on the dog. I know we're not supposed to spy on people, but the dog doesn't know how to sue me. So I'm not sure if I'll be able to see it or not. He has a little doggy bed over here. We'll see if we can find him in there. It looks like I won't be able to see it. It's right in that little corner there. Anyway, I am able to control the Seestar from a half a mile away. So I'm guessing that it doesn't matter how far away, as long as you're out of the range of being able to connect to it because you're just close by it. And so I could put this at my daughter's house or out at a dark sky location. But that was interesting to find out that I needed to do all the connecting before I left the presence of the Seestar. I thought kind of that was part of the purpose, is that you could connect to it if it's somewhere else. So it kind of defeats the purpose of being able to ship your Seestar down to one of those astronomy observation places and then being able to control it. Well, I don't think you could without being there to power it on and connect to it before you started left its range. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure I'm wording it right. So it does leave me with a few thoughts about the new app update. I don't think it's completely ready yet. I mean, it's still a great option. You know, I can still go and take it to my daughter's house who has a better view to the south, whereas I do not have a good view to the south. And I could leave it at her house, leave it powered on, even leave it plugged in or whatever to so that it didn't run out of power and control it from home. It does one other thing I probably ought to try is if I am connected to it remotely and then the app closes, whether accidentally or, just, I don't want to set this up at my daughter's house at 9 in the morning and not be wanting to image for 12 hours and leave the app running. And so if it disconnects, if I disconnect and turn off the app, I don't think it will reconnect because it's not in the proximity to detect that Seestar anymore. Anyway, that does leave me with a few thoughts, and here's what I think. These are just my thoughts, so leave in the comments what your thoughts are. So here's the first stuff I think we need to think through. The security. Well, we want to prevent our Seestars from disappearing from wherever we're going to remotely locate it. We don't want it to get stolen off of our porch, our daughter's porch, a dark sky location, whatever. We need to protect it from the elements because if we have to connect to it and then go leave the area, we need to protect it from the rain or the sun or the wildlife. Um, you know, I if we could remotely connect to it without it being in our vicinity to connect to it, this might be a little bit different. But since we have to be in the vicinity of it to connect to it remotely, and then we can leave and go somewhere else, odds are that we're going to be doing that within the same time frame, most likely. But I live in Utah, and if I wanted to go and put my Seestar down at Monument Valley in central Utah, well, that's a good 4 or 5 hours away from me. Well, how am I going to protect it security wise? I wouldn't want to be 5 hours away and have a rainstorm come through and no way for me to get to that Seestar to get it out of the elements. So it's not real practical for that. I'd have to rig up some kind of box or device or some way to protect it. I know you can probably buy those astronomy observing tents or something like that, but how am I going to remotely open and close those? And it would get really expensive to do that. So I'm not real sure about this one. So I don't know at this point if it's something that I would put far away from my home. I want it to be fairly accessible, just because I can't prevent all the things that could happen to it. We can't ever probably protect it from wildlife, but the sun and the rain, storms can pop up and wind can pop up and people out in the wild can pop up. And so that's something that we probably need to think through is how we're going to keep our equipment secure. The next thought I had was powering it. Well, it's okay to power it and turn it on and then drive a half mile away and the power's going to last. It's probably going to last 4 or 5 hours just with the battery that's in the Seestar. We can attach a battery pack that will add another 4 or 5 hours possibly. We could add even bigger battery packs that would do longer periods of time. But if we're going to put this somewhere really remote and we're going to work through the how to turn it on and connect far away, we need to figure out how to get some power. So some of the thoughts I had was a solar power bank. I'll put a picture here of one that I use. I use this on I have a hummingbird feeder with a camera in it, and this is a USB-C solar charger, and I'll put a picture here, and I can put links to this kind of stuff in Amazon too if you wanna look at it and examine these, but, battery packs would work. If you were putting it at a remote place like a cabin or something, you may have power that you could actually run an extension cord and plug it into. Of course, then you have to deal with, well, what if a storm comes up? We don't want it raining on an extension cord necessarily. So that's something else we need to think about is how long is the power going to last? And are we going to be close enough to go and remedy that if it does lose power? So the power is a hurdle, a small hurdle, because I think the security and being able to connect to it remotely is the bigger issue than the power because there are options for power. The next thought I had was thinking about turning it on and off. Well, we can turn it off in the app because we've got control over it. We can just log in or click on the advanced features or the settings of the Seestar, scroll to the bottom and slide the to turn it off. Well, the turning it on may be a problem. So probably the solution to the turning it on would be to use a finger bot or a switch bot. I'll put a picture here of what they look like. I'll also put a link in the description box to all of these things I've talked about in case you want to look into them further. I have used a switch bot to control. I have a fireplace and it has a remote thermostat that's across the room, but you have to manually turn it on and turn it off. And so I use a switch bot on that. So it automatically turns it on at a certain time of the day so that my fireplace will turn on and heat the room. And it turns off at a certain time. So a switch bot would be a good option for turning it on. That still does leave us the hurdle of being within the vicinity of the Seestar to connect to it, though. So I think that is probably the biggest hurdle that I can see is you have to be within, I think it's about 50 feet that I can connect to my Seestar, but you have to be in the vicinity to connect. So it does you no good to be able to turn it off and then turn it on the next day if you're not close enough to actually connect to it. And so I think that connecting remotely is the biggest hurdle, but this is what a switch bot looks like. What they do is you set them up on your phone, and then you have an app that controls this switch bot. And when you push the button, that little thing at the top there comes out and acts like a finger and will push down on a button or a switch. There are different kinds of these. This is kind of like the one that I have that just pushes a button. And so you could use that to do power on the Seastar. The next thought I had was for solar imaging or scenery imaging. You do have to be careful when doing these. You don't want the sun to be shining in and ruining your sensor. So you would have to think through what you're going to be imaging. If you're doing scenery mode or landscape kind of imaging, how are you going to get that solar filter on or off? Um, Also, the same kind of thing for the dew shield. Are you going to leave it on all the time or, how are you going to power it off and pop that dew shield off? Those are some thoughts I had. Even though those are fairly minor ones, we would just have to make a plan before we set it up somewhere remote and know what we're going to be imaging so that we know whether or not we need the solar filter on or not, or the dew shield, and or if we're going to leave the dew shield on just as a precaution, know it's on there and don't have it automatically shut down or get one that pops off. That's fairly minor in the scheme of these sorts of thoughts that I'm having. Another issue that was rumbling through my brain as I was thinking through this stuff is the setup. If we're going to do it in azimuth mode, what about the leveling? If we're going to do moon or sun imaging, it will require us to be level, even though when we initially set it up, we are going to try and get it as close to level as we possibly can. But, is there going to be wind that's going to move that or shake it, or an animal could go by and possibly bump the tripod or whatever it's on. There could be cars that drive by that shake and rattle the ground near it that may shift it off of, its level. The EQ mode, it would be hard to do EQ mode if you aren't close to it, because if you set it up in the daytime, how are you going to get the polar alignment and have it all set up and then drive away and then turn it on at night? Well, you can't really do the polar aligning unless it's dark. And so you would have to do it in the dark and then drive somewhere. So you really would have to be fairly close to it to make this useful as it is right now. There's no way to change the polar alignment. And then you'd hate to do the polar alignment, get home, and find out, oh, it's not quite imaging right, and you want to adjust it. Well, now you're going to drive back to wherever it is to readjust the polar alignment or the leveling or something. It could be fairly inconvenient unless you had some way to electronically control the level. So as it stands right now, I can see that this would be useful if you're going to set it up remotely in your vicinity, whether that be across the street, a couple miles, maybe even 15 miles away, but you need to have access to it. To one, set it up and connect, and to level it and do the EQ, polar alignment. You need to be fairly close in order to do that and to manage that throughout time. The biggest hurdle that I can see with this is having to be in its vicinity to connect to it. Because if you're putting it somewhere remote, that's the whole idea, is it's remote and away from you. And so being unable to connect to it would be a big hurdle. I think the other things could probably be managed through other than that being close to it. We could MacGyver some kind of box to put it in, or um, a way to open a little door. I thought about maybe those chicken coop solar controlled doors that will open and close. There would be ways to remotely open and close it, but you would have to have the enclosure and be able to move the Seestar out of the enclosure so that you could image. So I think this is a great move in the right direction. There are just a few things that would need to be worked out so that it is useful for long periods of time away from you. We'll put some of the links of our thoughts in the description box, as well as a link to the Seestar itself. And we're wishing clear skies for everybody. Thanks for watching.